Now, I have one last economist to introduce you to. In a way, I've kind of done my own worldly philosopher's essay, but I'm special, so I get to bring in an economist from outside the book. And one last cautionary tale. This man is George Fitzhugh, and his claim to fame was being the greatest of the Confederate economic thinkers. He was known as being the Southern socialist. Man from antebellum Virginia, the same society that had created the founding fathers. And yet he represented a very, very different interpretation of humanity. Now, Fitzhugh was troubled by the same issues as Marx. He lives in the same time frame as Marx, writing about the same kinds of subject matter as Marx. And Marx, as you know, he gets essentially radicalized. Well, he had already been kicked out of Germany, but Marx develops a lot of his theories from his exposure to the worst aspects of industrial capitalism in Britain. And likewise, Fitzhugh is going to be deeply bothered by what he sees as the social crisis of the industrial North. When he looks on the North, he sees this Dickensian hell world where it's every man for himself. Nobody owns anything except for a small group of people. And those owners do not care about their workers at all. They see them as machinery, but worse, they see them as being completely interchangeable. You have northern factory workers who are working like 14-hour shifts in the factories on the verge of starvation. They can just barely afford to buy enough food and pay their rent. You know, maybe a suit per year, one change of clothes. And they are all equally interchangeable because if one of them keels over from lack of medical care, if one of them keels over because of an industrial accident or because of just the pace of their work, they can be replaced the very next day by another immigrant fresh off the boats. Fitzhugh looks on this and he is deeply disturbed. And he looks to his own society, slave-owning antebellum planter society, and he says, this is better. What I see in the North scares me. And I prefer the system that I know. Because in the system he knew, the slaves were well fed. The slaves were clothed and housed. The slaves have access to medical care, and the slaves are fertile. They have one of the highest fertility rates ever seen. He's going to compare this world where people may be livestock, but they are livestock that's taken care of. He's going to compare that to the world of the North. And he says, your system is what's inhumane. Your northern bourgeois are cannibals. Cannibals all. And they devour humans. They devour their lives. In my society, people preserve life. And he titles his book, Cannibals All. And this ends up becoming one of the most influential economic treatises of the fire eaters of the Confederacy, of that pro-slavery movement. Now, Fitzhugh is an economist, and he's enough of an economist that he understands that markets are necessary for efficiently allocating resources and that people take care of their own property. But he doesn't believe in people's ability to choose for themselves. He believes that the poor are always going to be outwitted by the rich. He believes that the poor don't have the sense of refinement enough to be able to make meaningful use of leisure time or of a higher income. He essentially views the poor as being like dumb animals in a way. That as long as they are fed and brushed and cleaned and kept in a good sty, that's all they need. And an individual's desires for themselves don't factor into his calculation. And where this gets like demented and surprising, the reason I share this with you is because Fitzhugh argues slavery is so good, we need to enslave whites. We need to enslave poor white people because this isn't about race. People in general cannot be trusted to live on their own. And he gets a positive reception to this. Fitzhugh was building off of a philosophical tradition that goes all the way back to Aristotle. Now, Aristotle had a lot of good ideas. This was not one of them. He believed that there were essentially two kinds of people. There were natural slaves and natural masters. And the natural slaves, which was the majority of humanity, were people who lacked the wisdom, who lacked the higher intellect, who lacked the internal drive to manage their own lives. They wouldn't be able to do anything meaningful with choice. Left to their own devices, they're going to fall into chaos and just live in their own dissipation. But there is a small minority, aristocracy. That word means like the best, right? There is this group of people who have a more cultivated sense of virtue, who are more intelligent, who have to step in and take care of these others. And it's because these people are more attuned with sort of this higher state of being that they're able to enjoy leisure time and enjoy a higher income, enjoy the finer things of life in a way that gives meaning to life. When Fitzhugh writes about this, he calls it his mud sill theory. The mud sill is like the base of a window where the glass kind of droops down over time. That all the things that make civilization worth having come from this upper class, but the upper class must always have a lower class to support it. Science, art, human achievement in general. Now, Fitzhugh is a racist, like basically everyone in his day. He believes that a much greater proportion of blacks are natural slaves than are like, whites. But he still believes that most whites are natural slaves, and he believes that some blacks are natural masters. In Fitzhugh's worldview, the idea of, for example, a black man owning a white man is completely admissible. And there was another common belief in Fitzhugh's day that you could not have a republic without slavery to support it. Because how are your citizens going to be able to dedicate themselves to the kind of self-cultivation it takes to be a good citizen if they don't have other people to live off of? There's this people like to say presentist now to refer to like a bias towards the present day. There's a very presentist view of the early American Republic, that there is this contradiction between the premise of Republican values and liberty and slavery. In the South, they don't see it that way. And they don't see it that way because the Greeks and Romans didn't see it that way. There was, if anything, liberty was sweeter, and liberty was given its meaning by being contrasted against people who did not live free lives. It was necessary for some people to be enslaved in order that others might be free. Well, Fitzhugh, he takes all of these ideas and he develops them into what was the most intellectually sophisticated defense of Southern slavery, arguing that at its core, if men cannot be trusted with their own affairs, men must become property. We live in a world that respects nothing but property. And so if the poor cannot function on their own, men will have to become chattel. If that is the only way to get something as cold and unfeeling as the market to respect them. And he concludes with this very famous quote: slavery is the very best form of socialism. Fitzhugh regards himself as a socialist. And Fitzhugh is going to support the Confederacy. Most of the Confederates are not like 100% in agreement with everything he says, especially not the part about enslaving whites. But he lives through the Cold War, and he supports the Confederacy as a war in defense of his socialist ideals. Now, like Marx, his ideals would destroy a civilization and leave a deep, irreparable scar on American society. And he was just one economist, but his ideas were symbolic of the direction of the time, of a society that had gone insane. Now, something to keep in mind is that in the Founding Fathers' generation, slavery was viewed as evil. Not a necessary evil, just evil. Did that stop them from owning their own slaves? No, they were hypocrites. In some ways, I want to compare it to the celebrities that bitch about global warming while flying around in giant jets everywhere. On the other hand, I feel like that's a little too casual of a comparison given the nature of the subject matter. They were morally flawed, and I think some of them were worse than others. But the one thing they had in common is that even if they had deep moral failings in their own lives, they pushed the country in a direction towards the abolition of slavery. It's Thomas Jefferson that gets slavery banned in the Great Lakes states. It's also him, I believe, who gets the Atlantic slave trade banned. It's during the American Revolution that the northern states all enact gradual emancipation policies. This generation, they were aware of the contradiction between all men are equal in slavery. They were aware of that. That's how you get to the point of a union later down the line. But in the South, something changed. And it was the cotton gin. I know every one of you that's American that was raised in this country knows this story. The slavery was a dying system until the cotton gin. Founding fathers had a hope that this would just kind of wither away on its own, and it was. But then along came a technological change that rewarded plantation style slavery. And suddenly it became not just profitable, but it became the entire cornerstone of Southern society. And people begin to change their outlook on slavery corresponding. It goes from being an evil to a necessary evil. And then it goes from a necessary evil to, in Calhoun's words, a positive good. It becomes something that they're not just defending, but they're proud of. The Confederates put slaves on their money in the same way that, America puts presidents on its money. George Fitzhugh was just one economist. His most radical ideas were not embraced by the public at the time. But what stands out about him is how he shows the direction that society was going. Fitzhugh would, in his books, rail against how foolish the Declaration of Independence was. He would rail against how the founding fathers were idiots, especially Jefferson. He had a big hate on for Jefferson. Fitzhugh wanted to go back, much like Marx, to the merry old days of feudalism. And he lived in a culture where they were doing that. Plantation owners were having things like jousting competitions. They started to give each other made up titles, mostly things like colonel and judge. But they're giving each other titles because they really like the idea of being medieval lords. This was a culture that was rejecting its foundations to move in a new direction. And you have Fitzhugh at the very front of it, pushing forward, saying, we've gone from slavery is evil to slavery is good for the black man to slavery is good for everyone. And the scariest thing of it all is that the system seemed to work. Not in the sense of working to maximize human well-being, but in the sense of making money and being stable and growing. The South was beginning to industrialize at the start of the Civil War. There's often been this assumption, it used to be taught a lot when I was a kid, that slavery would have ended on its own. I don't think that would have been the case. In the end, this would end in tragedy. A whole generation of young Southern men was killed. Towns were burned. Whole sections of states were completely depopulated. There was famine. There was plague. The people were subjugated to a foreign government that in the end would cripple the southern states, turn them into essentially colonies. Their whole world went up in a holocaust of flames. And they lost everything. And it was Grant who said something like, never before had a people fought so valiantly for so worthless a cause. I had this dream once where I was a slave. I was reading old Works Public Administration PA interviews. So back during the Great Depression, they hired out of work writers to go and talk to old timers, Indians, former slaves, pioneers. there was this really surreal moment in history. It wasn't surreal to people at the time, but it's like in hindsight, it's odd. There were Confederate veterans who were still alive in like the 1950s. Well, Union veterans too, right? Civil War veterans. There was this period of time where you have motor cars and airplanes and television and all that, and you also have, people who who fought the Indians with tomahawks. These WPA riders, they were sent out there to just preserve as much of it as they could before it was all lost. No, I'm reading this collection of interviews with former slaves. They're like 90 years old at this point, and one night I had this nightmare, and it was so vague. I don't remember if I was black or if I was white. I I didn't I wasn't beaten. I wasn't working in the fields. It was one of those really vague, cloudy things that just comes and passes. But I remember feeling this absolute despair at the realization that I was no longer in control of my life. That every day I would wake up and my day would be stolen from me. It shook me to my core. I doubt that Fitzhugh ever had a moment of reflection like that. Because such men as him and such men as Marx never do. They always see themselves as smarter than everyone else. They always assume that they're the natural master, that they're the one who's going to be at the top, at the commanding heights, to use one of Lenin's phrases, directing everyone else. They don't imagine themselves wearing the chains. They don't imagine their flesh being torn from their back by the whip. They don't imagine their daughter or wife being raped. And in their wake, they leave behind chaos. I doubt Fitzhugh ever had a moment of reflection like that, because such men as him or Marx never do. They always see themselves as smarter than everyone else. They don't imagine themselves wearing the chains. They don't imagine the flesh being torn from their back by the whip. They don't imagine their daughter or wife being raped. And in their wake, they leave behind chaos. Countries often come to these forks in the road of what they want to become. And the sad thing is that very often they make the wrong choice. They choose evil. They choose it for their own greed. They choose it out of misguided motivations. But they will make the wrong choice. And when they do, nothing is left at the end but ash and the tears of the regular folks who get swept up in their visions.